You're listening to episode 43 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Stephen Schettini speaks with us about his experiences as a Tibetan monk in his book, The Novice, Why I Became a Buddhist Monk, Why I Quit, and What I Learned. We're very fortunate to live in a time when we can have experiences our ancestors could never have dreamed of. Our modern communication age is shrinking the world, often in a good way, as we're able to learn from people we would not otherwise have met and participate in cultures foreign to us. We find mixes of people, beliefs, practices, and attitudes about living in the world, about what it means to grow as a person. How wonderful the opportunities are for us all. Whether it works out and we integrate ourselves into environments strange and new to us, or whether we simply don't fit and move on, there's always something to learn from where we go and the people we meet. Today's guest is Stephen Schettini, here to speak with us about his experiences as an Englishman, becoming not just a Buddhist, but a Tibetan monk, and how he grew from that experience after setting robes and bowl behind. Stephen is the founder and director of Kudo.ca Communications and Quiet Mind Seminars. He's led hundreds of meditation workshops in the Montreal area since 2003 through www.thequietmind.org, and has contributed columns regularly to local newspapers and to The Suburban, Quebec's largest English-language weekly. He also freelanced for the Montreal Gazette. Stephen made a living in print communications and over the next 20 years authored, co-authored, illustrated, and designed dozens of books on information technology and health science. So, sit back, relax, and have a Balvenie Doublewood. Neat. And we are here with author Stephen Schettini. Stephen, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Oh, very, very glad to have been really looking forward to this. I've been enjoying your book, The Novice, and we were just chatting about that before we started the interview. What I'd like to do is ask about what your background was growing up and how you came to have a Buddhist practice.
Well, I grew up in the west of England. My father was Italian, and so I grew up as a Catholic. And he was a reconvert, which is to say that he, as many Italians did at that time, he left the church quite abruptly when he was young. But he came back to it with a sense of great faith, and he resolved to raise his children in the arms of Holy Mother Church. So we went to church every Sunday. I was sent to Catholic primary school, Catholic secondary school. I was taught by monks and nuns, and I really tried to be a good Catholic boy, but I think I tried too hard because I couldn't, I wanted to make sense of stuff that you're not really supposed to question. I was unable to. So, the long and the short of it is that I ended up, leaving the Catholic Church but not leaving behind a basic visceral need which my teachers had given me to to go beyond this material life and to see, I always thought that there was something more. There must be something more. So I kept looking, and I looked in very strange places, including Marxism and spiritualism and astrology and all those things. And when I finally came up against Buddhism, things started clicking. And I hitchhiked out to India. I met the Tibetans, and they were extremely welcoming, open, and that's when I basically settled down into a regular Buddhist practice.
It was interesting in reading the book that some of your experiences in India and the things you ran into with some illness and experiences with controlled substances and things like that were very much mirrored also in Bhante Rahula is a monk who until fairly recently was in West Virginia, and he also wrote a book about his experiences, and he is still a monk in the Theravadan tradition. Where he went through the same things. He went through the same questioning. And it seems that it just happened that he ran across the Theravada practice, he ran across the Tibetan practice.
Yeah.
But up to that point, the same questioning and the same rejection of a previous tradition, because it wasn't answering the questions that you had, and yet there was a thirst for something else that you found in the Tibetan tradition. Now, how did that progress?
Well, to say that I found it in the Tibetan tradition is, that's a very broad and general statement. I think by the time, as you say, I'd gone through that process, not only of rejecting my upbringing, but also getting involved with drugs and traveling widely, not just geographically, but mentally as well. So that when I did meet the Tibetans, one of the things which was very welcoming to me, or which was very helpful, was just the sense of belonging. It was good to find a home. In fact, I needed it. I was in very bad shape, physically and mentally, and I needed that stability. So that was the first thing that I got from the Tibetans. And in a philosophical sense, yes, some of my questions were answered. But my rejection of Catholicism wasn't so much because they couldn't answer the questions, but because they tried to stop me asking them.
Yeah.
And eventually that's not exactly what happened with the Tibetans, but it was clear that many of my questions were unwelcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were chatting a little bit before the interview started about questioning, and that with the tradition you had come from, there was discouragement from even asking questions.
Yeah.
And that in the tradition you'd found in the Tibetan practice of Buddhism, questions were encouraged. In fact, debate itself seemed to be a large part of that context, the cultural context of the Tibetan practice, but that it seemed that the questions needed to be answered thus, and other ways of addressing them really weren't okay.
Well, yeah. It's there's a certain amount of flexibility, and if you're raised entirely in the Tibetan tradition, that probably seems like quite a lot of leeway. But if you're raised as a Westerner, then we have a much broader scope from which to come with our questions. We don't work just within the confines of Buddhism or Eastern thought. We have a number of different philosophies, and we're used to picking them up and putting them down. By the time you've gone through a basic education in the West, you've come into contact with dozens of different philosophies, many of them totally contradictory, and you're used to asking questions and pointing out differences from one tradition to another. So in traditional Buddhism, you don't have that scope, which in one way is very comforting. It keeps things simple. And that's certainly reflected in the Tibetan language, especially the language of debate, which is extremely succinct. It's very tight, and it brings an enormous precision to it, which gives the illusion of unshakable correctness.
Yeah, that was one of the quotes that you had in the book. To mention to people who are listening to the podcast, you were a monk at the same time as B. Alan Wallace and Stephen Batchelor in Switzerland, I believe.
Yes, in Switzerland.
And one of the quotes that stood out for me as I was, again, going through the book last night, was one of your letters back and forth with Stephen Batchelor is, and this may have been a direct conversation you had about the language, and one of the points he had made was just what you had said, is that the Tibetan language was very concise with what it was addressing, but wasn't hitting the broad scope of some of our needs. And the example that was brought was guilt.
Yeah.
You'd ask, what was it that isn't covered by this? And Steve immediately said, guilt. Yeah. Of 52 mind states, something like that? Yeah,
you have the mind and its, and the 51 mental factors, which are the core of what's called Buddhist psychology. And, the mental factors are things such as focus, concentration, mindfulness, and then there's anger, faith, and so forth. So you expect a certain state of mind, common states of mind to be there. So guilt was a huge thing which was missing. And that was very instructive. And to bring that up to date, in fact, I've noticed recently talking with Tibetan teachers, people who've been around Westerners a lot, have suddenly come to appreciate the fact that Westerners suffer from this thing called low self-esteem, which for Tibetans is, there's no translation for it, and so the Tibetans who've really mastered English well are still quite mystified by it. And it still seems to be a cultural difference, a huge cultural difference, which is quite something. Perhaps guilt is not exactly on the same level as that, but I think it doesn't have the same significance outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're very much, as Westerners, we have this goal-setting behavior, and if we don't meet our goals, then there is a flaw somewhere, and whether it's in what the goal was, or how we got there, or us. And when it's something like a meditative practice where it's just us, it's very difficult for us to, if we're not, levitating by 8 o'clock, day one, yeah. There's a certain, we're somehow not adequate to this task. And there's a lot of self-questioning that we're doing that doesn't seem to be part of the Tibetan cultural makeup. Yeah,
very much so. Very much. Well, one of the things that all the Tibetans were always saying to all of the Westerners was kale kale, slow down. And this was an almost universal message, and I have many memories of Tibetan lamas simply laughing at us. And when I think of it, I laugh too. It certainly wasn't malicious. It was just, it illustrates a huge difference, and we were driven in ways which they're not, and that has all sorts of ramifications.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, you ended up not continuing on as a monk. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to that, and then we'll kind of get onto the book that you wrote about it and the website, but I want to talk briefly about that experience itself.
Ted, if I'd done what Bhante Rahula had done and entered the Theravadan tradition, I might not have come to the same turning point, but I didn't. I entered an extremely religious tradition. Well, on the one hand, it's very religious. Tibetan Buddhism, to me, is like the Roman Catholicism of the East.
Yes, they have big hats.
Yeah, that's a good one. They have big hats. They have lots of rules, lots of history, a huge amount of ritual, a lot of prayers. On the other hand, I was trained in the Gelugpa tradition, which is very scholastic. If you go down to any of the big three monasteries in South India, Sera, Drepung, and Ganden, you'll be excused for thinking that the primary purpose of Buddhism is to study. I spent 1.5 years in Sera Monastery, and I never saw a single monk sitting in silent meditation. It doesn't happen.
I'm just in that section right now where you're at, in the book, where you're at the Sera Monastery, and you're talking about exactly that in the passage I was just reading, where it is very scholastic, and the idea of you finding a quiet spot on your own to do your meditation was something of a challenge, because it was a very noisy, active place.
Oh yeah, it's a very, very busy place. It's like a combination between university and a secondary school, because you have all the elder professor monks, and you have the boys there learning and memorizing. It's there's a lot of bustle. There's a lot of activity. I have to say, it's a very cheerful place. The Tibetans have really mastered the art of cheerfulness. It's quite extraordinary. But they're also extremely good at public relations. They seem to have it in their blood. They've had an enormous impact on the perception of Buddhism in the West. In fact, they basically monopolized it, really, in the last 25, 30 years. But to get back to my leaving that tradition, on the one hand, when I realized to what extent this was a religious tradition, and I felt the same sort of claustrophobia that I'd felt as a young boy going to church, and on the other hand, the scholasticism, which was very interesting and very intoxicating in a certain way, because knowledge is intoxicating. It's sort of like accumulating. Some people like to accumulate money, some people like to accumulate friends, and some like to accumulate knowledge. And then there's the illusion that, well, this is Buddhism. But of course it's not Buddhism. It's about Buddhism.
Right. Yeah, it's the finger pointing at the moon.
Yeah. It's not the practice. And when I went to my teacher, Geshe Rabten, I said, Geshe, I want to meditate. He immediately said, first you study, then you'll know what you're going to meditate on. And when he said first you study, he meant the next 20 years.
Not a few weeks to get the basics, and then you can start your counting your breath.
Exactly. Anyway, after my stay at Sera Monastery, I decided to just take the ferry across to Sri Lanka, and I went into retreat there entirely in the Theravadan tradition. In fact, they consider themselves the seat of Theravadan, and there I experienced my mind very closely at first hand, not for the first time, but for a length of time which I'd never before gone through. And I saw with great clarity the state of my mind. And from that point, the thought of spending the next 20 years studying books just became a complete absurdity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I just couldn't, I couldn't see that as a path. Not in any way. I had my ambitions. I always wanted to be a teacher. But I felt that my integrity was in danger. And in fact, I stayed a monk in the Tibetan tradition for another year after that. I returned to Switzerland. I took up duties which I'd promised to my teacher that Geshe Rabten I would come back and pick up. But finally, I had to make the break.
It seems that in reading the book, you and I know Stephen Batchelor had a similar experience, that you found traditions that, as you described, are very, very religious. You found Tibetanism as probably the most of the very, granted, rich and beautiful traditions in the practice of Buddhism.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one that, as you'd already rejected that kind of approach to personal development, that this was replacing one with another, and it was still as equally a bad fit in that, with all of that, the religious part of it, but that the practice itself was something that was still very appealing and remains so.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think I could sum up what you just said by saying that it was intellectually appealing, but emotionally, not.
So, tell me about the actually not becoming a monk, and what happened there and what that was like.
That was very hard. I'd been taught so much stuff. And after my stay in Sri Lanka, I knew that I had more than enough to fill the rest of my life with meditation. I didn't need to add to my store of knowledge so much as clarify it. And I decided that the way to clarify it was to, simply take that knowledge to, a completely different environment. An environment that to me was an ordinary one. In other words, back home in the West, because my ambition to be a teacher was to be a teacher to Westerners, not to simply continue the tradition the way the Tibetans had done it. And just to step back a little bit, there was a time at the beginning when I met the Tibetans, and as I say, I felt this sense of belonging and being welcome. And in some part of my mind, I think I was trying to become a Tibetan. I was trying to leave behind my Western roots. So by this time, 8 years later, it had become clear to me that that was not only impossible, but that it was counterproductive. So I brought all I knew back to where I came from. In fact, I moved across the Atlantic from Europe to Canada. And I got a job and I started making a living by myself. I was out of touch with my teachers. I was out of touch even with my old friends, with Stephen Batchelor and all the others, for many years, trying to live, you can't see me right now, but I'm
yeah, quiet,
inverted commas here, ordinary life, which was really, really hard. And I got lost in there many times. But once the Novice, my memoir started coming together, and that was a long process before it really took root, and especially once I met my wife, my Caroline, was not just a friend and not just an associate, but really somebody of like mind who gave me a foundation from which to put all this past in perspective again. Then I began teaching. I started teaching mindful reflection here in Montreal. We set up quiet mind seminars together. And all of this stuff started coming together. And I realized that over those difficult years in the West where I'd been isolated, I had learned a great deal. It wasn't always pleasant. It always wasn't stuff that I'd really wanted to learn. But, that's life.
Yes, it is. It is going to be.
That's also what the Buddha was talking about. When he said we were deluded, he meant it. If the process of meditation and of practice is to remove the illusions, then of course there's going to be a sense of disillusionment. And, Chogyam Trungpa speaks to that very, very well in the way of meditation. And that's where I'm at right now. I teach, with great joy to very ordinary people who would never set foot in an ashram or a temple. They wouldn't even think of it. But they're very interested to know what really lies behind the doors of Buddhism. And I try to express that in plain language.
And that's what really the secular Buddhist movement, if we want to term it that, is about, is that if the teaching itself is valid, and we believe it to be so because we have put it into practice in our own lives, that it doesn't have to have a particular cultural context. It will work regardless of cultural context.
Exactly, yeah. And I have to say, when I stumbled on your website, I felt that same old sense of belonging once all over again, which was very comforting.
Good. I'm very glad of that. And I do hear from people every week who share that same thing. I know Stephen Batchelor also gets notes from people regularly saying, thank you for putting this out there. It's given me permission to be comfortable with not having a traditional way of practicing Buddhism, but doing it in my more modern, secular way, and that's still a valid way to do this.
I think it's not just still a valid way. I think this is the core of what will bring Buddhism to the West if such a thing ever happens.
Yeah, I agree. To speak more about that, because that's really what we want to get to, is what our future is going to look like and how it's going to grow.
Well, I mean, the important thing is that we have better human beings around. It doesn't really matter if you call them bodhisattvas or Buddhists or atheists or Christians for that matter. I tell my students that we're making the world a better place, one person at a time.
It's a great tagline.
Politicians have been trying to do it from the top for years, and look what a great situation we're in now. If you read the Old Testament, things are not really all that different today. Still, basically, you've got people going to war with each other for reasons of ego and money, mostly. There's not much change.
Interestingly, I participated in an interfaith dialogue a month or two ago about religion and politics. And I was the token Buddhist, and we had a Christian representative and a Jewish representative and Islamic representative and a Hindu, and we were all there talking about how our different traditions interrelated with the political sphere.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that I made a point of saying is really Buddhism has never been separate from the political sphere. That Gautama himself would have been, as the character, if this was an historical figure, would have been in a family of affluence, would have grown up with people of affluence, was constantly, according to the suttas, getting involved with stopping wars and talking with the kings and leaders of the time in the area in which he lived. And that has continued throughout history. And one of the reasons why we see that is that this is a bottom-up kind of transformation. That it's not, here is your list of prescribed, regardless of circumstances, behaviors to which you adhere. It's changing the individual from the inside, and out of that their actions will naturally be more positive and contributory to society.
Yeah. Actually Stephen Batchelor has an extremely interesting take on this. He believes that the Buddha, when he set out, had in mind a transformation of the society in which he grew up and lived.
Right.
And that was basically thwarted during his lifetime. It didn't work.
Yeah, Stephen said he wanted to, his lines on that are he wanted to create a culture of change.
Yeah.
And that's what this in secular Buddhism is about, is having that, creating the energy around a culture of positive change.
Yeah.
Moving us in a more beneficial way for everyone.
Yeah. But of course, I mean, especially in the West, we want to think of that in terms of our lifetime. Which in Buddhism you don't do, and Tibetan Buddhism in particular, they love to count in astronomical numbers and talk about 3 countless great eons before you reach awakening. That's just for one person, So we come back to this kale, go slowly, take it easy. Which maybe is the advice that Gautama himself needed. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm taking a look at the website that you have set up, and for people who are listening in via iTunes, the address is www.thenovice.ca, and this is the website that's really dedicated to your book, The Novice, Why I Became a Buddhist Monk, Why I Quit, and What I Learned. And that last phrase that you have in there, what I learned, to me is the most important thing that comes out of the entire story, that the writing of the book provides an excellent personal story of personal growth. And it shows why and all the experiences you had and the relationships and how they contributed to where you are now and what you got out of it. And one of the links that you have on there is the 15 Truths. Tell us a little bit about that and what these truths are and what you've learned.
Well, 15 Truths. That was actually my publicist extracted that with the Schettini's 15 Truths, and I felt a little bad about that because the Buddha only had 4,
Branded here, 15 in yours.
So it seems a bit presumptuous of me. But first of all, the reason I call this book, or the end of the subtitle is What I Learned, has disappointed a couple of people because they thought they were going to get a book describing what Buddhism is all about and a nice, structural breakdown, which of course you can find pretty well anywhere. But that's not what I did. What I learned, when I said that, I meant what it meant to me in a very personal way. At the end of the book, there is this paragraph where I realized, well, it's time for me to fess up and say what I did learn, because basically most of the book up to that point is about what I don't believe. And there's a lot of stuff I don't believe. And I think that beliefs are a necessary evil and should be kept to a minimum. But nevertheless, there are some things that I believe, and so I wrote them down in this paragraph. And as I say, my publicist took it apart and he made it into 15 truths. So these are things that come to me from my experience. These are things I believe that have been substantiated by my experience, that are not theoretical, that have nothing to do with. They're not beliefs based on beliefs. They're beliefs based on my experience.
Right, and it's said very well on here is that true insight comes from personal experience, not from language or scripture. And you describe some external things, where really it's what is, and as Buddha said in the I think the Kalama Sutta is what you by your own experience, and that's what you're getting at here. Yeah,
absolutely. By the way, that citation from the Kalama Sutra is probably the most the thing that the Buddha said, which is most responsible for Westerners being attracted to Buddhism, more than anything else I think that he said, makes it completely digestible and acceptable to anybody who's secular in any form at all. So that was my second point, and it's actually the Buddha's point. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the Kalama Sutta, and the Chanki Sutta is another one that I frequently bring up, because that's taking a young Brahmin to task about, you weren't there, nor was anyone in your lineage 7 generations past. The only intellectually honest thing to say is, we don't know.
Yeah.
And that's something that, in whatever our practice is, we don't know. So when we hear I know past lives exist and Buddha says so, and therefore, like, stop. You weren't there. You don't know what Buddha said. What you know is what we have in the Pali Canon, but we don't have a videotape of of the Buddha giving a talk, and so the most we can do is say we're not sure. And what I find particularly appealing about the suttas is starting with evam me suttam, thus have I heard.
Yeah.
It really does lend a nod to, this is something that I have heard. It's not, I was not there. So we need to take it with a grain of, put it into practice yourself. See what it's like.
Absolutely.
Ehi passiko, come and see. Try this. And use what works.
I mean, if I was there, and the Buddha said that, or I'm sure somebody else, Stephen Batchelor, would stand up and say, well, wait, excuse me, how do you figure that? We would ask why, and we would hold our reservation even then. I think, actually, these 15 truths that I wrote, I have 2 which are my favorites. One of them is that, the only way to respect truth is to take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's one thing the Buddha made clear. And if you do want to go to the Mahayana Sutras, you go to the Heart Sutra, where Sariputra basically goes through everything he can think of, every sense object and every mind object, and he says it doesn't exist. And the Buddha basically at the end claps his hands and says, yeah, right on. It's, yes, there's a profound philosophical teaching about shunyata in there, but also there's an emotional liberation of, just take a step back.
Yeah, the perspective is a very important thing that we tend to lose sight of, and that comes into play as we're talking about conventional reality, of the two of us talking and people listening, for example, and ultimate reality of, well, yes, there's subatomic particles and it's all just a big mess of energy. Well, yes, that's very true. That doesn't mean, though, for example, we can use terms like, quantum thought and lend credence to the nonsensical idea that we impact reality with our thought. It's just, I'm sorry, there's no evidence for that. And people saying that there is are welcome to prove it. That would be awesome. Haven't yet seen it to date. And if it can't really be shown and it has so little impact that you can't really identify it in any way, then it really doesn't contribute at all. It's meaningless. It doesn't have any impact.
Well, I don't know about not having any impact. I mean, I presume you're referring to Deepak Chopra here.
I might be. Causing an earthquake with his meditation.
Sure. I mean, if you really want to analyze his ideas and put them to the test, then, I'm sorry, but they're pretty flaky.
I might agree with that.
And yet, is he moving people? Is he getting stick in the mud rationalists to let down their guard a little bit sometimes? If he is, then that's not a bad thing.
Then there's positive effect, and I think that's the cause and effect interpretation of karma being not so much a cosmic justice system by which you do a bad thing, then the universe is going to get you because it has to keep things finely tuned. No, it's a cause and effect. If I do something bad, then bad feelings would occur, and that will have perfectly natural effects in the world. That's really where at least in our modern culture, interpretation of karma has more ground than a mystical, untraceable interpretation of karma.
Yeah, but the mystical version, or the Judeo-Christian version of karma, which is what most people say, and this is the stuff you hear on TV sitcoms, that's taken root.
Yeah, My Name is Earl is giving a complete interpretation of, karma is you do this, and then bees will sting you.
Yeah, exactly. It's some sort of divine retribution. We're back to square one again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's because people, irrespective of what tradition and culture and educational system they grow up in, people really have desire to believe certain things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Basically, as children, we want to believe in magic. And we want to believe that if we pray, then we'll get results. That if we treat other people nicely, then they're going to treat us nicely. It works sometimes, but there's no guarantee.
Right, and it gives us a sense of some kind of control over our environment. And that in itself is comforting. And that perhaps gives us enough comfort to move forward with whatever it is we need to do.
Yeah. But you can go too far with that. That's the trouble.
Yes, exactly. It's like,
too much, then you get stung.
Right. I can now, through my meditation, I can make my plants grow faster. Whatever it may be.
Yeah, and if you actually do, and if you can demonstrate it, then that apparently is significant, which is another a very flaky thing. I mean, it's irrelevant. It's like this book written by the Australian author, The Secret. Her new book is called The Power. This woman, who, by the way, who turns out to have been formerly a very successful television producer, she knows exactly what she's doing. And she's saying basically, if you believe in something strongly enough, you'll get it. If you believe in it in the right way, you'll get it. In other words, if you're not believing it, if you're not getting it, you're obviously not believing it.
You're not doing it right, but there's no actual measure of what right is.
Exactly. So it's a very self-contained and self-serving philosophy, which is selling millions. She's making a fortune out of this. And otherwise intelligent people are embracing this with open arms. Because if you think strongly enough and in the right way, you will get what you want. But nobody is questioning whether getting what you want is really going to help.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't question the basic premise that getting what we want brings happiness.
Exactly. And so, really, this is pure consumerism, which is dressed up as spirituality.
I was delighted to see a Simpsons episode just last week. It may have been in rerun, in which they parodied The Secret. In which one of the characters got a copy of the book called The Answer.
Okay.
And it was clearly based on this, and in which it led, I think, their teacher, Ms. Krabappel, into just a delusion. She created her own business and just didn't really want to do it, and it wasn't working, and but you might not have been thinking about it in the right way, as you're saying.
Yeah. We need a Simpson family in the secular Buddhist community. This is really the attitudes in that show are really very instructive.
They are, and Lisa is an out Buddhist. And with all of her other, I would say she is perhaps one of our most famous secular Buddhists.
Yeah, but she's her
using reason constantly.
Yeah, she's a good Buddhist. She's not silly.
She's entertaining, not silly. Yeah. So, Stephen, where do you see this secular approach to Buddhist practice going in the West in the next few years, and what are ways that you see people can participate in that? What are some of the challenges that we have to helping people be more aware of this?
Well, I think the big challenge is in considering what we're creating exactly. You know, when I look at the debate, for example, between Alan Wallace and Stephen Batchelor, which is basically a debate between tradition and creativity, if you like, in which neither side can really be allowed to win, because, you know, if the people who survived the death of the Buddha had decided to get all creative, we wouldn't have the faintest idea what the Buddha actually said and what sort of record he left behind. So we need some sort of traditional structure there to maintain that. So when I teach now, I'm not teaching from a traditional structure at all. I'm being totally creative, which is what I do, and I'm certainly getting a great response from my students. I'm obviously doing something right. But what are they going to teach from? There is still going to have to be an establishment which, I guess, I mean, human beings being what they are, is going to be a religious establishment, which is what most Buddhism is in the East. You go into virtually any Buddhist temple and it's religion. There's no two ways about it.
And that's one of the challenges that we face in the creation of a non-profit. Is one of the things I'm working on for secular Buddhists, is a non-profit that is specifically for secular Buddhism. And Stephen Batchelor is participating in that and contributing to the ideas on the formation of that. And that's one of the challenges that we face, and what a number of the listeners have written in about is, how do we legitimize and properly identify, here are people who would be teachers that are of a caliber that are going to be able to help folks, because it has been in the past, well, you need to be of this lineage.
Well, it has to be very practical. I think rather than see this as a university or a monastic scholarship foundation, I think we should see it as a trade school. We're teaching people skills which either work or don't work. And I think it would behoove us very much to be as practical and as modest as that.
And I think that's one of the differences that we have, and this is another question that occasionally comes up, is how we differ from secular humanism, is that, you know, we've looked at taking a model on for how secular humanism has organized as a group, and there are really good and valuable things to learn from that. But one of the primary differences that we have as Buddhists is we have a methodology, a practice, and a way for personal development. And this is one of the things that Paul Kurtz, who was the founder of the Center for Inquiry, has occasionally commented on in Free Inquiry magazine, is that their need for a methodology. And that's something that, on the bright side, we have that. It's how to espouse that. And maybe what you're talking about with a kind of education and practice and a trade school type of model, because, as you're saying, these are skills. Maybe that's something to incorporate into how we move forward with secular Buddhism.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about that. And yet, we're creating an organization. I mean, I wonder what would happen if the whole religious establishment of Buddhism just evaporated overnight. I mean, what would secular Buddhism then mean? Would it still be just a skill set? I mean, we learn and we develop a lot in criticizing, hopefully criticizing in a creative and positive way, the establishments which have gone before. But if secular Buddhism becomes an establishment in its own rights, then it will need its own critics. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but I think it's an exciting adventure, and
it is.
I don't think we should have to know where it's going.
Well, and Buddhism has gone through changes with every new culture that it has encountered. It is now hitting a modern Western culture. There's a lot of steam around that now that it's been gaining in the past 100 years. Mm-hmm. And now we're getting to a point where really it's getting enough that we can distinguish it and label it. And we don't always meet the same labels, and we may mean somewhat different things, but we have a general idea of a non-religious contextual practice of Buddhism and how we move forward. I mean, all of us are very concerned about, we don't want to break it. We want to do this right. If we don't know quite what that is, and we're feeling out as we go along.
Yeah, but I mean, there's no such thing as, to paraphrase the Buddha, there's no such thing as Buddhism. Mm-hmm. Right. There's only people who are practicing these skills. And you're going to get a whole range of different people, and some of them are going to be really authoritarian and traditional, and some of them are going to be really flaky Hollywood types. Which is not to say that anyone who comes from Hollywood is, I don't mean that in a disparaging way.
Yeah, Hollywood listeners, please keep listening.
But that you meet people who call themselves Buddhists who really don't know anything about it, and who think it's about holding to certain beliefs. They talk about reincarnation, and they talk about karma in very uninformed ways, and they believe that makes them Buddhists. And these people, whether we want it or not, are part of the Buddhist community. Just like people who believe that God sits on a cloud, are part of the Christian community.
Right.
So, no one's in a position to direct it. We feel that way when we're standing in front of a crowd teaching, or, if you're setting up a non-profit foundation, you may feel probably that you're creating something of your own, but it's sort of like, I think, having a baby.
Yeah.
And you don't know how that baby's going to grow up. You can nurture it, you can cultivate it, you can give it the essentials it needs, which is love and care. Then you got to let it go.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I've been struggling with, is all the models that I've been looking at and the people have provided and suggested of, okay, so how did you do your organization? Because there are particular rules that you need to follow in terms of officers and boards and all that kind of thing. Uh-huh. And that's been, for me, one of the biggest challenges, is making sure that this is a flexible, scalable thing that will grow up on its own and continue on, and I'm just, here's the initial, and now it will evolve and grow on its own.
It must be an enormous amount of work. I tip my hat to you.
It's challenging. Well, tip your hat if it works and get it done.
Well, if it doesn't work, it'll be the foundation of the next thing, which someone will try. It's all steps in the right direction. And there are no ultimate goals, are there? There are only steps anyway.
Exactly. It's all process.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, the website, again, for people listening, is www.thenovice.ca, and there are also a couple of other spots. I know you also have www.schettini.com, and that's SCHETTINI.com.
Yeah.
And you also have, do you have a blog that you're working on?
I've got a blog, yeah, the nakedmonk.com.
Nakedmonk.com.
TheNakedMonk.com.
The Naked Monk. Got it.
They're all connected.
And you also, you have events. You have an events link on the Novice website, so people can get hold of you there.
Yeah. They can get hold of me through any of those sites. I also have thequietmind.org, which is where I advertise and coordinate my my workshops and seminars.
Mm-hmm. And you have it looks like you have regular Quiet Mind workshops set up.
Yeah, I teach throughout the year, mostly in Montreal, and people have been coming to those classes and workshops for about 8 years now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a great foundation for me. It really means a lot to me to have these. These are ordinary people, like I say, who would never normally set foot in a temple. Very challenging. They want stuff that works. And I can't sit there and talk for hours about the theory of emptiness and the two levels of existence. I can gloss it, but basically I have to explain how that relates to real life. And in that sense, I find I'm becoming much more of a storyteller than a teacher of philosophy. And that suits me fine. I think that's a very venerable tradition.
It is, and storytelling itself is something where you tell a particular story which people then incorporate into their own experiences and take from there and grow with. And that's what you've done with the book The Novice. And what you do, as we were talking about, it's something where you're setting it going, and then it will grow on its own based on the person's experience themselves.
That's the idea. Yeah, it's to give people a little jump start.
Excellent.
And,
excellent.
If they want to go and see what it's like to be a Buddhist monk, then great, all power to them.
Yep.
Go find out for yourself. That's what this is all about.
Excellent. Well, the book is The Novice, Why I Became a Buddhist Monk, Why I Quit, and What I Learned by Stephen Schettini. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Ted, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.